While bored at home, you decide to channel hop on the TV in your room. You bounce from different channels, from SpongeBob to Pokemon. Finally, you stop on a channel you're unfamiliar with. On the screen appears to be a man in a bear costume. This isn't Bear in the Big Blue House, nor is it Sesame Street. This man is saying something, but you have to raise the volume to hear him, as his voice is muffled. He's talking to a kid that has just entered the scene. "Welcome to Mr. Bear's cellar," he says. "We're going to have lots of fun." This is the premise for a popular creepypasta that started its story in a blog post. The story was published on a blog by Camden Lamont, the blog being called Slack Lane. The first draft will be published in 2009 under the name of the year the story began. The name of that story is 1999. Of course, this is the official story, one put out by the creator. This story goes deep and is an interesting rabbit hole in its own right. We will cover that later, as we need to see this story as it stands today and what effects it had on the internet and the creepypasta community as a whole. 1999 is one of the most popular stories to ever crawl out of the internet. The amount of notoriety, intrigue, and fandom this story got was notable. In the early days of creepypasta, this was considered one of the shining examples of what this genre could be. The story takes place from the perspective of a child who used to watch a local TV channel, Caledon Local 21. The story focuses on the channel, a character named Mr. Bear, and the mystery behind it all. Before we go too deep into the dive, let's take a look at the story that started it all. The year is 1999. That sentence brings me back to my senior kindergarten class when I was 5 years old, when we used to read out the date on the blackboard every single day. The year 1999 exists as a stain in my mind, however, as a memory that will not go away no matter how I try to forget it. 1999 marked the year I lost my first tooth, my first time on a plane, and unfortunately, the early loss of my childhood innocence. This is the opening paragraph of our story. Some early themes can be gauged here. The easiest one to see is loss of innocence. The year 1999 being chosen is also important thematically. The year that separates a decade is always seen as a transitional period. Putting that together with the loss of innocence, you have a story that's going to be a coming-of-age tale, one with some questionable material that forced the narrator to grow up a little too quickly. The narrator of the story is named Elliot. Elliot explains a memory that refuses to leave his mind, and it all starts with an old TV in his room. When he was a child in the year of 1999, the biggest fad was Pokemon. The cards, the games, but most importantly for him, the TV show. Pokemon aired at a time that was inconvenient because his dad liked to watch the news at the same time. All of this led to him getting his own TV placed in his room. It was an old TV with bunny ear antennas that got only local channels. It specifically didn't get the channel that Pokemon was on, but he didn't really care as he was excited to have his own TV. The TV unfortunately only got 20 or so channels. Of those 20 channels, only one was worth watching. Months later, Elliot stumbled upon a new channel, Channel 21, more accurately known as Caledon Local 21. Even his dad was surprised to find that the channel existed. The channel, on the surface, seemed to have children's programming, so his dad was fine with him watching it. The shows that played on Caledon Local 21 were bizarre, and Elliot could hardly understand what was going on in most of them. He was interested regardless, though, mostly because of how messed up the shows were. He would then list off the different kinds of shows that he saw on the channel. April 1999, Mr. Bear's Cellar episode 12 is the first episode that Elliot remembers watching. The name of the show was unusual to him. Why would anyone want to go to a place called Mr. Bear's Cellar? What good ever happened in a cellar? The show's main focus was on a man who wore a cheap-looking bear costume and would invite guests, all children, to visit him in his cellar. The show had the worst-looking camera quality that Elliot had ever seen for a TV show. He was unaware of the style of the channel. This was also the show that the police would ask the most questions about later. The episode had a very simple premise. Mr. Bear sat alone at a table playing checkers. This went on for a bit before he was interrupted by a knock at his door. The camera changed angles to look up at the cellar door from the bottom of the stairs. The man in the bear costume is then seen climbing the stairs as another knock rings out. He opens the door to two kids, one girl and one boy. Mr. Bear then leads them down the stairs and into the dark cellar. This was after he did a little dance upon seeing his young friends. The cellar was lit only by an oil lamp, providing no light. This made the footage blurry, as good lighting is needed especially for cheap cameras. The episode continues with Mr. Bear singing a muffled song through his mask, followed by the three of them playing hide and seek. This is the first show that Elliot describes. Mr. Bear's Cellar sounds almost like a bad spin-off of a show you would have seen on a kids' channel in the early 2000s. The mention of the cop also layers some intrigue into what might have happened here. Two kids enter a cellar and are met with a man in a bear costume. He sings, dances, and then plays a game with the kids. All of this together would seem creepy to us, but not to a 5-year-old. His innocence is still intact. The next show aired in May 1999. It had a weird title, but maybe not uncommon for a kids' show. It was called Soup and Spoon. Elliot says he wasn't sure it was an episode of a show, a TV special, or a movie. Either way, he didn't really get it. This show barely registered in Elliot's memory. First, he found the concept really stupid. Even thinking so as a kid, it altogether was a show that put him off of the channel for a while. That, along with Pokemon, changing its airing time. The show was the most low-budget thing he'd ever seen. It starred a can of soup and a spoon, kind of obvious from the title, that was held up by strings in front of the camera. The whole thing looked to be shot in the same cellar as the previously mentioned shows. The show was only a half an hour and comprised of scenes that Elliot found dumb. The spoon would chase the can of soup around as if trying to eat him. The ending had 7 kids sitting around a table. They had a bowl of soup in front of each of them, and they were all looking at the camera. Some of the kids wore confused faces while others seemed frightened. This is when the cameraman says, "Spoon's ready," before it all ends. Here we have another low-budget show that felt like it could have been a kids' show but clearly wasn't. The soup and spoon aren't that important. What is important is the kids. The kids, 7 in total, were sat around a table in the basement with frightened faces. The kids had likely already been through something that Elliot wasn't aware of, something that happened off-screen. With little to go off of, we continued to the next show. July 1999 would be the next time that Elliot watched Caledon Local 21. He forgot about the channel until he was over at his friend's house. His friend had just gotten a new TV in his room, and the pair decided to channel surf before landing on the weird local channel. It was 9:30 at night, so he was surprised that anything was on the channel. Mr. Bear's Cellar episode 23 was the next episode he watched. This episode was the first one to set off alarm bells in Elliot's head. Not very loud ones, as he was still only around 5 or 6 years old. It started with the camera awkwardly placed on its side, with Mr. Bear talking and walking up the basement stairs. This cut to black for a moment before fading back into Mr. Bear talking to an older kid. He was maybe 11 or 12. Elliot couldn't make out what was being said until the older kid started talking loudly. He said something along the lines of, "It's getting late, I need to take my sister home." Other voices were barely audible in the background as well. Mr. Bear then tells the kid to get out, as he wasn't invited. This caused the kid to march up the stairs. He then stops at the top of the stairs and yells down that he was going to call the police. Mr. Bear then breaks into a run up the stairs, leading to the kids screaming and running away. The episode abruptly ends there, being replaced by static. This next episode is the last listed and is probably the most important. Here, Mr. Bear addresses the audience directly and sends out an invitation. "Hello, kids. Do you want to visit my cellar? If you do, please write me a letter at this address." This was enough for Elliot to actually do the unthinkable and write to him. A few weeks later, he received a letter back. I'm going to read it in full, as the way it is written is important for something we'll discuss later. It reads, "Dear Elliot, thank you ever so much for your letter. I would love to have you in my cellar. We play games, watch movies, and go fire camping in the middle of the woods. Come to my house at," the police cut out this address, "Caledon, Ontario, Canada. I look very forward to having fun with you. Love, Mr. Bear." This isn't the worst of it though, as Elliot's dad didn't find all this sketchy and actually took him to the address. The first blog entry ends here with a message stating that the police got involved at this time. The police asked him questions and showed him pictures of frightened kids in the woods. He doesn't have all of the answers, but it's all coming back to him, now that it seems Mr. Bear is trying to get into contact with him once again. The next blog post was updated on November 14th, 2009. This update answered some questions that Elliot was being asked through email and continued the story. He'd gone to the house that Mr. Bear lived at. It was in an open field and looked like a farm-style home. When they walked up to the door, instead of being greeted by Mr. Bear, they were greeted by a police officer who talked with Elliot's dad. After the conversation, his dad took him home. They never talked about what happened at that house. The channel was also gone with no new content on it. This was how it was until Elliot turned 13. He finally got the answers he wanted from his dad about what was actually going on. The channel that Elliot used to watch was called Caledon Local 21, which we know at this point. It ran from October 1997 to August 1999. It aired out of the Peel region of Ontario, Canada. The owner of the channel wasn't known in town, which is odd since the town was small. The reason he was able to pick up the show was because it was available only to old TVs with antennas. The owner of the channel wasn't identified, but he was Mr. Bear. He created the channel for the reasons you think. He wanted to lure in children, so he created shows that would cater to them. It was never stated what his inspirations for his shows were, but you could guess from seeing them. He kidnapped children, not for the nefarious reasons you'd imagined, no. They were for much worse reasons. Luckily, the day that Elliot had arrived, the man had fled the premises, the night before, and gone on the run. It wasn't lucky for the other kids though. This is when Elliot realizes something. He wasn't the only one watching. This is effectively where the first post ends. It could end here entirely, as it's a spot where you get the idea of what's going on. You don't have all the answers yet, but it is satisfactory. It didn't end though, and we would receive updates in a blog style from here on out. The next update wouldn't come until December 2nd, 2009. In this post, all he does is answer questions sent to him by readers of the blog. The first question was about who else had seen Caledon Local 21. Here Elliot says that at least 2 other people watched the channel. They also talked about 2 shows that he'd never seen before. The first show was called The Fallen Angel in Life. In this show, a man rambled on in front of a camera about how he needed to please Satan before it was too late. The second show was called Paint with the Soul. It was a show that was described as being similar to the Blair Witch. A man wandered the forest with a camcorder, but nothing else happened. The next question asked about what happened to the man inside the bear costume. He can't answer because he doesn't know where he is either. No one knows what happened to the man. He says that hopefully he'll find answers soon, as he's going to talk with one of his dad's friends who used to be on the force. The final question was about what happened to the kids in Mr. Bear's cellar. Elliot responds by saying that this is the most common question he receives. He got the answer from his dad's friend, who was a Caledon regional officer. The man, Mr. Bear, took the kids out into the woods near his property. They aren't sure exactly what happened there, but they found the charred bodies of 16 children, ages between 4 and 13. They were found in a ditch that was 15 by 15 feet. He wasn't given any exact details, but said that he was seeing his contact on Thursday, so he would keep everyone updated. He thanks everyone for showing interest in his blog and promised to gather more information. This whole thing has made him more interested in what really happened on the channel in 1999. The following update was made in January 2010. Here Elliot talks about a lead he'd found through the father of a kid he used to babysit. The man used to live near the woods outside of Caledon and witnessed some strange activities in those woods. One day, while sneaking off to smoke a blunt, he found a man in the woods with 13 to 17 children. They were all standing around a fire pit and chanting in a language he didn't know. The kids, as young as 5 and as old as 12, joined the man in these chants. Anthony, the man who witnessed this all, remembers asking them what was happening. The other man explained that they were on a camping trip. It was something they did often. Anthony, finding this strange but overall harmless, asked them to keep it down. He then explains that they never did keep it down. From this lead, Elliot made a list of possible connections. The fire pit in the woods might be the same as the ones the kids were found in. The language they were chanting in might be a lead worth going down. And there was also something interesting that the man had mentioned to Anthony. He said that he was moving soon, to a small city called Pickering. Elliot figured he would take this information to his ex-cop contact and see what he could find. He promised to keep everyone updated. A month passed and another update was added. This time there was a lot of new information. Elliot was able to go to a police station, thanks to his contact, and watch a few of the videos that they had seized. He then goes on to describe them. Starting with Paint with the Soul, episode 10, Garbage Thrown Away, this show was exactly like it was described prior. It was a man walking into the woods with a camcorder and looking around. Eventually, he would find a bunch of trash strewn about the ground. He walked up to each piece and recorded them for a few seconds while mumbling something. He said that humans were like trash, they needed to be cleaned up. As stupid as it sounded, the video gave Elliot the chills. This, he said, was probably because the woods that were being recorded looked just like the spot where the children's bodies were later found. The next video was another Mr. Bear's Cellar episode. It was episode 25, but there was no title to it. The video has the man in the bear costume distributing orange juice into 16 shot glasses. He then pours a single drop of an unknown liquid into each glass. Walking off camera, shuffling can be heard. Mr. Bear reappears with 16 children walking behind him. There's one kid in the bunch that Elliot recognizes, an older boy with bruising on his face. He soon remembered where he recognized him from. He's the one who threatened to call the cops at the end of an earlier episode. The episode ended with a song about drinking juice and how good vitamin C is for you. The kids sang along and drank their juice, some reluctantly. This is where the update also comes to an end. Elliot reaffirms his interest in finding out more about Mr. Bear and Caledon Local 21. There had to be more out there. The story that he got from the police was that he might be a cultist who preyed on children. He needed to know more. The next update wasn't uploaded until May of the same year. Elliot was finally able to drive on his own and decided to head down to see the house again. He arrives and finds the house is no longer being used as a daycare. How ironic. But instead it now sits empty. There was a for sale sign in the yard, so somebody was trying to get rid of it. He wandered past the house and into the woods. A little way in, he found some logs in a circle with a spot that looked like it had been holding a fire recently. This is where he ran into two boys. They told him to leave their fort and even pulled the knife on him. Elliot stood his ground and the boy put his knife away. Elliot asked them if they knew about the man who used to own the house. He then explains his connection to the area and the channel that started it all. This got their interest. They revealed to him that Mr. Bear had become somewhat of a local urban legend. They said that he lived in the storm drain near a playground not far from their fort. He was seen by several children, and each time he was seen either in his suit or with just the mask on. This was enough for Elliot as he decided to leave for that day. He would be back to check out that storm drain though. Not that he believed that he could be hiding in there. It still caught his interest enough to search it though. The next update would come in October, another long break between uploads. Elliot had taken a trip to see the pipe where the man was supposedly living. He saw absolutely nothing, but he claims to have uploaded images to go along with the search. These images I couldn't find, not on the blog or anywhere else online. The reason this update was made was because of a strange email that Elliot received. Here it is in full. Dear Elliot, my dear, dear boy. You see, this story may or may not be true, but it could happen. There are many slots for airtime. If you have money, you can have a public access TV channel. Some public access channels share airtimes with EWTN, religious channel based out of Michigan, that shows Catholic-based programming, but during off-air hours have independent shows or just blue screen. Cable networks have EMTY channels available for rent space. So the scenario of a pedo renting a channel on basic TV is not far-fetched at all. However, public access TV is widely reviewed and can be terminated at any time. These are the rules for the United States, not for Canada where this story took place. So if this happened in the US, the pedo would be tracked and arrested immediately. Yes, this story could happen, but it is unlikely. 100 fuzzy hugs, Mr. Bear. The email was obviously faked, at least in the mind of Elliot. Yet, it still reignited his interest in the case. The grammar in the email was abysmal, which didn't exactly match up with the prior one he'd received as a kid. Still, he wanted to continue pursuing his case. The next update didn't have anything new to add to the story. It was mostly just letting everyone know he would continue updating the blog. Near the end, he does mention a new tape that was found by the police at a local library. He plans to watch it when he can and update soon. A new update arrived on January 21st, 2011. This one starts with Elliot explaining that he was home from university. He'd finally been able to rest for a moment before deciding to dive back into his investigation. He'd been able to go to the local police station and see another episode from Caledon Local 21. This episode was titled Mr. Bear's Cellar, Episode 30. The episode began like many of them did, with Mr. Bear setting up the camcorder. He then spoke to the camera. Hello, children. Today I will be doing a wonderful thing for my friends. I will be delivering them to a faraway land where they will surely be happy. The camera then pans around to show an ATV with an attached trailer. Inside the trailer were 7 still children. They were lying side by side. Mr. Bear then began to address the camera again, stating that this was only the first batch and more will arrive soon. The camera turns around again to show a large tarp on the ground. He pulls it away to show a pit underneath. It was 12 feet deep and 15 feet wide. The remainder of the episode consisted of Mr. Bear picking up and dropping each kid into the pit, one after another. The camera then panned over to several bottles of gasoline beside a bush. The episode ended there. This is the exact pit where the charred remains of the children had been found by the police. He'd used the orange juice concoction he'd made to put the kids to sleep before tossing them in and burning them alive. This tape wasn't the only one. There was another tape, one that the police contact had claimed to be damaged. It was working, but what it contained was the burning in the pit, something that he didn't think Elliot could handle. Elliot actually agreed with that. Between this post and the next was a poem that was written about Elliot. It reads, INRI. Once upon a time, there lived a boy named Elliot. Elliot was a clever boy who loved playing with his friends. One day, he watched a lovely television show about a bear and his children friends. The children loved helping each other as good children should, but they also loved the bear. The bear loved the children since the children were so good at helping him and the fallen angel. The children and the bear wanted to play together forever with the help of their angel friend. But the fallen angel needed even more help, so the children had to give the ultimate sacrifice. Because that's what friends do, Elliot. They help each other. Help us, Elliot. Burn with us, Elliot. I want you, Elliot. He wants you, Elliot. Come back to my cellar. Pretty please with sugar and icing on top. Signed, Mr. B. INRI. This was supposedly added by a random person who hacked the blog. The addition of INRI at the end makes me think otherwise, as well as the fact that the text is perfectly punctuated. INRI is a Latin inscription that means Jesus, the King of the Jews. Here we have another religious reference, and the way he signed off with it makes it seem like he's referring to himself as Jesus. How this note is written makes me think it might be real. Somehow, Mr. Bear got into the blog and added an update just for Elliot to see. It's unnerving, but seems likely. Somehow, Mr. Bear got onto the blog and added an update just for Elliot to see. It's unnerving, but seems likely. The multitude of religious references is starting to paint a picture of what it all means, but we'll get to that later. The final update to the story was uploaded on April 5th, 2011. The update starts with Elliot explaining that he decided to watch the final tape. He needed closure, and he hoped this would bring it to him. After getting in touch with his contact at the police department, he had to convince him to let Elliot view the final tape. They came to an agreement that Elliot would be allowed to watch it when he turned 20 years old. This is why the update took so long to upload. He had to wait. On his 20th birthday, he called his contact, and even though he still had to fight for it, he was finally allowed to see the final tape. He wasn't exactly sure what to expect. He had been told before that the final tape showed the children burning, but he didn't know what that would look like. No horror movies or gruesome documentaries could prepare him for what he was about to see. Mr. Bear's Cellar, episode 31. Began in a forest, the same one from the prior tapes. It was filmed at night, so everything looked like vague shapes thanks to the low camera quality. The camera panned over to the pit where smoke was rising from it. Elliot was asked by his contact if he really wanted to watch it. He replied that he had to, for his sanity. The camera moved toward the pit. Inside, vague shapes could be seen burning. It took a few moments for Elliot to start making out the bodies of the children with skin blistering red and some even blackened. Some of the shapes made strange motions, while others were completely still. There was no sound to go along with this disturbing imagery. There was a cut to dawn. The camera panned over to a figure in the distance. It was the Mr. Bear costume strewn across the ground. It was positioned in a mock cross shape. The cameraman walked around the costume as if he were worshipping it. The head of the costume was placed next to the body. There were red letters written across the forehead of the mask. It read, INRI. The camera slowly zooms in on the bear's face before cutting to black. It was finally over. Elliot is asked if he's okay, and he says that he is, but he knew that wasn't the case. He'd gotten closure, but it wasn't helping him the way he thought it would. He felt something in his stomach. Survivor's guilt. He could have been one of those children who died that day. Instead, he was here, and they weren't. The final paragraph looks promising for the overall story. It ends with Elliot claiming that he's finally over episode 31. The horrors that he's witnessed that day no longer haunted his dreams. He promises to keep everyone updated as he's found more tapes at other police stations. Of course, this is the final update. It ends with him thanking everyone who keeps up with the blog. So ends the story of 1999, one of the more popular creepypastas from the early days. The ending is the problem most people have with this story. It didn't feel like a send-off exactly, more like a promise to return one day. The thing is, there were no more updates. It was all over after this. Many readers felt like they wanted more and they should have more. The ending was abrupt, but there was more to tell. Or was there? This ending could have a few interpretations, but none of them felt satisfying. Regardless of the ending, the story would be very popular online. It inspired a few continuation stories, all of which have been wiped from the internet for reasons we'll get into later. There was a mini-series created based on the story that was featured on Amazon Prime and even a game. Both of those are also gone from the internet. The spread of 1999 was rather slow, like a few stories we've covered before. It was mostly popular in the circles where it originated. It wasn't until big YouTube narrators covered it that it exploded in popularity. In 2014, it was covered by Mr. Creepypasta and some ordinary gamers who were both big in the community. Thanks to these narrations, the story took on new life. People were interested in the Lost Channel, and many had questions about the whereabouts of Elliot and Mr. Bear. Since the story just ended, many looked online hoping to find answers. All they found was the story, though. There were no continuations, not officially at least. So we had an ending that didn't feel like an ending. It felt like it needed more. If any of you read this story sometime in 2014 or 2015, you might be saying that something feels different here. You remember there being more shows and the whole story being longer. You also might remember a different ending than the one presented in this video. Well, you'd be right. This version of 1999 is different than the one that you read or listened to in 2015. For several reasons that I'll be getting into after we get into my thoughts on the story overall. 1999 is a certified classic. If you were to go onto the creepypasta subreddit or look up anyone's tier list, you'd see that 1999 is always in the conversation. Many people enjoy the story, and it is fondly remembered. My biggest issue with the story was pacing. It starts incredibly strong with a step back in time to when Elliot was 5 years old. He explains the premise well of a strange public access TV channel, with even stranger shows. From there, it starts to pick up pace and then jumps around quite a bit. It feels like each entry wasn't building off of the previous one, but rather trying to figure out the story as it went along. Like the author didn't have it all planned out yet. And instead was just writing as interest in the story grew. The first couple of updates feel planned, but the further along we go, it just feels super disconnected. The first show we hear about is Mr. Bear's Cellar. This is the most important show and also the most interesting on the channel. It sets expectations right away and also connects with other media we likely consumed from our childhoods. It also introduces the antagonist of the story. The next show we hear about is called Soup and Spoon. This show only got one episode in the entire reading and was pretty lackluster overall. With it barely getting an honorable mention, we have a few more episodes of Mr. Bear's Cellar to sit through, and then we're at Elliot in adulthood. I know that the point isn't that 1999 is the year for everything. It's supposed to be an important year as it's held an event that would follow Elliot for the rest of his life. But it's so weird how we got so little from that period. 3 episodes in 3 separate months. Very little variety, and the trickling of foreshadowing wasn't that great. We skip ahead and Elliot has graduated high school and is in college, it seems. He makes a mention of the college term being over at the end of 2010. He also mentions a roommate, and this whole period is where most of the reading takes place. The jump from 1999 to 2009 is only 10 years though. Elliot was supposed to be 5 in 1999. Probably turning 6, but now he's in college in 2009. He would be 15 or 16, and I'm not saying that he's not an advanced student or anything, but that's a little too young to be in college. In the Ontario region, he can legally move out at 16 and have roommates. But I doubt he would since he seemed to have a great relationship with his father. The age discrepancy bothered me throughout the whole story. There is a reason for it, and it's not because of a mistake that was made or anything. You see, I'm supposedly reading the story from the source, the Slack Lane blog. This is where the original story was supposed to be posted. There shouldn't be any mistakes like that in here, you'd hope. That aside, the biggest issue I had with the story was the lack of a send-off. I don't mind an ambiguous ending, I prefer it actually, but it feels like there was supposed to be something else here at the end. 1 or 2 more entries to bring the story wholly around. We didn't get that, Instead, we got a vague story about Mr. Bear sacrificing kids to Satan and believing that he was Jesus. I'm not sure how that works out exactly. The story felt like it ended too quickly. Not only did I not get a satisfactory ending, but a few inconsistencies pulled me out. I still like the story, but I feel like I missed something. Well, it's time to address the elephant in the room. 1999 is a story that was very popular in the community, but it's also one of the most controversial as well. You see, the story has gone through several changes, several claims of plagiarism, and an insane amount of internet scrubbing. This is the controversy of 1999. It all started with a podcast that was covering the story. As they were doing their reading of it, they noticed something strange. The story had another show, one that I didn't mention before. It was called Booby, a show with hands as puppets that was a satire of a kids show called Ooby. The controversy wasn't that the Ooby character was satire. No, that's fine. It was later. In one of the episodes of Ooby, the Ooby episode was a complete plagiarism of a popular ARG at the time called Alan Tutorial. The episode was shot for shot exactly what happened in one of his videos. After this happened, the author of 1999 came out and explained that his story had been stolen and uploaded to the creepypasta wiki without his knowledge or consent. This is where all the changes were found to have been made. So all the plagiarism was someone stealing his story, allegedly. After this, every copy of the story was completely wiped from the internet. Narrations by some ordinary gamers and Mr. Creepypasta were both removed, likely from a copyright issue. The author of the story started to systematically remove all traces of that plagiarized version. If you look on Reddit, you can even see whole posts that have a notice of copyright removal. From my sources, I heard that several channels were hit with copyright strikes just for reviewing the story, which is protected under fair use. Well, YouTube isn't the best, especially back then, at defending creators of the copyright system it created. With just about every source of the written, plagiarized story wiped from the internet, it's really hard to track any of this down. It's hard to prove the plagiarism, and hard to disprove it. Even the Wayback Machine has no record of the stories, likely removed for plagiarism as well. According to the author, the original story was posted in 2009 on the Slack the Lane blog. I found this original story, but it shows up nowhere on the Wayback Machine before 2019, which is when all this started. The 2019 version is also different from the one that can be found on there today, but I'll get to that in a second. What do I believe? It's hard to say, as I don't have all the evidence in front of me. A lot of it is just gone now, wiped from the internet, and that speaks more to me than if it were here, because you'd want to have evidence that someone stole your work rather than removing it so no one could see it. The copyright strikes and total removal of it all strikes me as more guilty than not. Going back to the pages I mentioned before, there are a few inconsistencies in them that make me lean more towards the guilty aspect as well. Firstly, the character was 5 during the first mention of 1999 as he states. The year is 1999. That sentence brings me back to my senior kindergarten class when I was 5 years old. The reason this is important is because he then states that he is in college and has a roommate in 2010. He would be 15 or 16 years old. Those dates, like I mentioned before, just don't add up. Well, as it turns out, the plagiarized version has different dates than in the current official reading, those being 2011 to 2013. Those dates actually do add up a lot more for the story. If it is set in 2011, that would make the narrator at least 17, so when he mentions a roommate in 2012, he would have been 18 or 19. This is such a weird thing to correct because the story was allegedly uploaded somewhere else before when it was added to the wiki in 2011. However, the dates in the plagiarized version add up more than the ones in the official story. This leads me to believe that the dates are all wrong in the original. They are off by 2 years, but they needed to be set in 2009 for the author's excuse for the mass removal to make sense. He needed the copyright date to be 2009, but it just doesn't work as it's written now. Another interesting date that throws us all out of whack is mentioned in the May 5th, 2010 update. There's a line that reads, "Did either of you hear of a guy who murdered a bunch of kids in these woods about 13 years ago?" This line is seen in the Wayback Machine archived version from 2019, but was changed in the recent version. The reason for this change is because, once again, the dates don't add up. 13 years ago from 2010 would be 1997. The channel was up in 1997, but the murders took place in 1999. This was changed after another YouTuber pointed it out. The change went from 13 years ago to just years ago, which reads really weirdly to me. There's one final piece I want to add before we move on. The person who wrote the original story was an engineering major in college, allegedly. Elliot, the protagonist of the story, is also an engineer, allegedly, because that part was also removed and could be part of the plagiarized version. Well, the person who allegedly plagiarized the whole story was also named giant engineer. Now I'm a believer in heavy coincidences, but this seems too specific to be one. It's not a smoking gun, and I can't say that this story was stolen. There are just 3 pieces that lean more towards the official story being a lie. My sources and my own research have led me to this stance, but I welcome any others that come forth. We shouldn't stand by our beliefs if there are facts that actually challenge them. I'm just interested in why all the dates just don't add up. The fact is, I get why having plagiarism attached to your name would want you to nuke every online story connecting it to you. As a writer, plagiarism will ruin your career. You would never have a future in that career path unless you wrote under a pen name. The sad reality of this whole thing is the removal kind of worked. The official story is the one that keeps the story alive today. Most people have no clue that there was any kind of plagiarism involved at all, even though most that remember the story read it back when the plagiarism was still part of it. As much as I enjoyed this story, I still think it's a standout amongst others of the era. The whole scandal kind of ruins it for me. By itself, the story feels incomplete. It goes too quickly and introduces the Satanism stuff at weird times. With all that out of the way, I did want to talk about possible endings for the story. With how it all ended, I felt like there was a subtext of something else going on. I have 2 main theories about what happened at the end of 1999. The first theory is that Elliot was found by Mr. Bear, with that last message being posted to the blog by someone who hacked the forum being our major clue. This would mean that Mr. Bear was finally able to get a hold of the one who got away. The other theory is that Elliot just lost interest. There are several times in his blog where he mentions the break between posts and having to find the drive to continue searching. You'd think that someone with this much trauma would want to keep searching until they reach a dead end, but that's never mentioned. With everything done, that was 1999. It's a story that holds a place in many a creepypasta fan's top stories of all time. It was in my top 10 for a long time, but that shifts more and more each day as I revisit the classics. The impact this story had on the internet can be felt, but it's hard to actually observe. Every project that took inspiration from it has been removed, it seems. The Amazon show, the YouTube channel that was doing recreations, and even the game. They were all removed from the internet. With a story like The Rake or Slender Man, you can still see traces of all the fan projects, spin-offs, and the like. Here though, you can see none of that. It was all gone, like it had never existed. Only lingering in the "this post was removed for copyright" littered across Reddit and other sites. The biggest inspiration I see is the creation of analog horror. The way the horror was focused on a strange local channel was very much related to the genre. You can even say that it could be seen as a direct inspiration. 1999 walked so Local 58 could run.